In the mid-1920s, deep within the shadows of the Caucasus Mountains, a secret was being forged that would challenge the very definition of humanity. Inside a reinforced laboratory in Soviet Georgia, a scientist named Ilya Ivanov was given a mission that sounded like a fever dream, born of blood and iron. He wasn't looking for a cure for a disease, nor was he looking to extend the lives of the elite. He was looking to build a new kind of man, a being stripped of the weaknesses of the human spirit. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel himself, wanted a soldier that was more machine than mortal. He envisioned a warrior who felt no pain, required little food or sleep, and possessed the raw, animalistic strength of a primate. They called it the living war machine. To the Kremlin, the human soldier was an unreliable tool, subject to fear, fatigue, and conscience. Stalin wanted to erase those traits. While the rest of the world was rebuilding from the wreckage of the Great War, the Soviet Union was funding a project to crossbreed humans with chimpanzees. This wasn't just a fringe experiment, it was a state-sponsored attempt to engineer a biological god of war. Ilya Ivanov was no amateur or madman working in a basement. He was a world-renowned pioneer in artificial insemination, a man who believed that the secrets of life were merely puzzles waiting to be solved by the Bolshevik Revolution. He convinced the Soviet leadership that if they could successfully hybridize a human and an ape, they would achieve more than just military dominance. They would prove once and for all that there was no divine soul, only biology that could be mastered, manipulated, and overwritten by the state. In the eyes of Ivanov, the soul was a relic of the old world, a ghost that kept men weak. By merging the human mind with the ape's physical resilience, he believed he could create the perfect citizen soldier, a creature of absolute obedience and terrifying power. With a massive grant from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Ivanov didn't start in a sterile clinic in Moscow. He traveled to the humid, oppressive jungles of French Guinea to set up a secret research station. He went to the source, seeking the genetic materials they needed to start his dark alchemy. His goal was simple and horrifying: to find the point where the human and a beast could finally become one. The conditions in the African jungle were as brutal as the experiments themselves. Ivanov's early attempts were met with repeated, agonizing failure. The biological divide between species seemed like a wall that nature refused to let him climb. But Ivanov was man-fueled by a regime that did not accept the word impossible. As his primates died from heat, infection, and the stress of his procedures, his methods became increasingly desperate. He began to push the boundaries of ethics further than any scientist in recorded history, treating the animals not as living things, but as spare parts for his vision. He eventually realized that the jungle was too unpredictable, too far from the iron grip of the Kremlin. He returned to the Soviet Union with a collection of surviving primates and a new, much darker plan. He established a permanent nursery in Sukhumi on the Black Sea and officially opened laboratory number 1. It was here that the project took its most sinister turn. Ivanov realized that to bridge the genetic gap, he needed more than just ape subjects. He put out a call for patriotic Soviet women to participate in a sacrifice that would change history. Records indicate that at least 5 women actually stepped forward. They were prepared to carry the first human-ape hybrid in their own wombs, all in the name of Stalin's secret war machine. The Red Frankenstein was no longer a theory. The labor had begun. By the late 1920s, the dream of the living war machine had shifted from the remote jungles of Africa to the sun-drenched, yet secretive shores of the Black Sea. Ilya Ivanov had established a specialized nursery in Sukhumi, Georgia, a place that would eventually be whispered about in terrified tones as Laboratory Number 1. This was no longer an exploratory mission. It was a high-priority state operation. Here, the climate was carefully controlled, the funding was limitless, and the ethical boundaries had been completely erased. The mission remained fixed: to create a hybrid that possessed the cold intelligence of a man and the raw, bone-crushing power of an ape. Stalin's interest in the project had grown from mere curiosity into a desperate necessity. He didn't just want a soldier. He wanted a revolution of the flesh. He envisioned a creature that could survive the freezing winds of a Siberian winter and the starvation of a scorched earth campaign. Inside the walls of the Sukhumi lab, the air was a suffocating mix of clinical antiseptic and the heavy, musky scent of caged primates. Ivanov had successfully transported several healthy chimpanzees back from his Guinea expedition. But the transition was violent and many succumbed to disease. For every death, however, the Kremlin simply provided more subjects, viewing the loss of life as a mere line item in the cost of progress. What elevates the Red Frankenstein project from a historical footnote to a true biological horror is the verified existence of human volunteers. As the 1930s loomed, Ivanov concluded that the only way to bridge the genetic chasm was through a human host. He didn't have to resort to the gulags for subjects. The Soviet propaganda machine was so pervasive that at least 5 women stepped forward, offering their bodies to be the vessels for this new species. These were not prisoners. They were patriotic citizens who had been convinced that birthing a hybrid was the ultimate act of service to the Bolshevik cause. The psychological reality of these women remains one of the darkest mysteries of Soviet history. They were kept in absolute isolation, monitored 24 hours a day by armed guards and a rotating staff of cold clinical doctors. They were the patient's zero for a species that shouldn't exist. Ivanov spent his days meticulously tracking their biological shifts, searching for any sign that the human womb could successfully sustain and nourish the hybrid DNA. It was a clinical, mechanical process, treating the most sacred act of life as a high-stakes engineering project for a regime that viewed people as replaceable parts in a grand machine. But nature proved to be a more formidable opponent than the Soviet state. As the years passed without a successful birth, the political atmosphere in Moscow turned lethal. Stalin, a man who measured success in iron and blood, had run out of patience. The biological barrier remained unbroken, and the cost was mounting. In 1930, the Red Frankenstein project was hit by a sudden, violent purge. Ilya Ivanov, once the golden child of Soviet science, was stripped of his titles and accused of being a saboteur of the state. He was arrested and exiled to the desolate plains of Kazakhstan, his life's work seized, and his laboratory in Sukhumi placed under even more secretive military management. The volunteers vanished into the silence of history, their names scrubbed from the records. The primates were left to waste away in their rusted cages. their screams echoing through the abandoned facility. Some whispered that Ivanov was purged, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. And the resultant creature was something so horrific, so beyond the control of the party, that the only solution was to bury the project forever. Ivanov died in exile shortly after, a man broken by the very regime he tried to empower, leaving behind only rusted syringes and a legacy of nightmares. For decades, the Red Frankenstein project was a ghost story whispered in the corridors of Soviet universities, a rumor of a laboratory that never existed. But when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the iron curtain that protected these secrets was torn down. Researchers and journalists began to pick through the skeletal remains of the Sukhumi laboratory. What they found was not a sterile medical facility, but a crumbling monument to biological hubris. The concrete walls of Laboratory Number 1 were stained with decades of salt air and neglect, yet the atmosphere of dread remained remarkably intact. Investigators discovered rows of heavy rusted steel cages, some large enough to hold a man, others designed for something much stronger. Discarded medical files damp with rot hinted at procedures that defied the medical standards of the time, while many of the most damning documents had been incinerated during the 1930s purge. The physical evidence of Stalin's super soldier dream was undeniable. The facility was a graveyard of ambition, where the line between human and animal had been blurred in the name of the state. In the hills surrounding Sukhumi, the story of Ilya Ivanov didn't end with his exile. For generations, the local people of Abkhazia have told stories of Abanawayu, the forest men. These are descriptions of large bipedal creatures covered in dark hair, possessing a strength that no human could match, yet exhibiting a terrifyingly human-like intelligence. While skeptics dismiss these as mere folklore or sightings of escaped lab primates, the timing of these legends often aligns with the periods of Ivanov's most intense research. There are darker rumors of Zana, a wild woman captured in the region in the late 19th century, whose descendants were said to possess anomalous physical traits. Some researchers suggest that Ivanov's work wasn't just about creating something new, but about capturing and weaponizing ancient, hidden genetic lines. The Sukhumi scream, a sound described as a cross between a primate's roar and a human sob, is still reported by those who venture too close to the ruins of the old nursery at night. It serves as a haunting reminder that while a project can be shut down and a scientist exiled, the biological consequences of their work may have a life of their own, hidden in the shadows of the Black Sea forests. The Red Frankenstein project remains a chilling benchmark for the ethics of the 20th century. It was the ultimate expression of a regime that believed nature was merely a resource to be conquered, and that the human body belonged entirely to the state. Ilya Ivanov died in 1932, a broken man in the Kazakh wilderness. The path he blazed has never truly been closed. Modern geneticists look back at his work with a mixture of horror and fascination, acknowledging that while his methods were monstrous, his understanding of cross-species compatibility was decades ahead of its time. Today, the ruins of Laboratory Number 1 are being reclaimed by the jungle, the concrete cracking under the pressure of the earth. The living war machine was never deployed on a battlefield, but the psychological scars of the experiment remain etched into the history of Russian science. It stands as a warning for the future, a reminder that when we attempt to play God in the pursuit of power, we often end up creating something that we can neither control nor understand. Stalin's invulnerable soldier was a failure of biology, but was a terrifying success of the imagination, a shadow that still hangs over the secret files of the Kremlin, the missing link of the Kremlin. As the gates of Laboratory Number 1 were welded shut, the world believed the dream of the human-ape hybrid had died with Ilya Ivanov. But in the world of Soviet intelligence, nothing ever truly stays dead. There are whispers in the declassified archives of the KGB that the research was moved even deeper underground, to a facility where the subjects weren't just animals, but the results of successful, undocumented births. If a hybrid had survived, it wouldn't have been a soldier on a battlefield. It would have been a state secret of the highest order, a biological anomaly that proved the state could create life without a god. The question that haunts researchers today is, what happened to the offspring? If the red Frankenstein was real, the genetic line didn't just vanish. Some theorists suggest that the project was absorbed into the broader Soviet push for human enhancement, feeding into the high altitude and deep sea endurance programs of the Cold War. The ape man may have been a failure in its pure form, but the data gathered from those screaming cages in Sukhumi likely paved the way for the chemical and biological augmentations given to elite Soviet divers and pilots decades later. CRISPR and the ghost of Ivanov today. We live in an era that Ilya Ivanov could only dream of. With the advent of CRISPR and advanced gene editing technology, the Red Frankenstein project is no longer the stuff of 1920s madness. It is a modern reality. In recent years, scientists in international laboratories have successfully created human-monkey chimeras, sparking the same ethical firestorm that eventually consumed Ivanov. The difference is that today it is done in sterile, brightly lit labs, under the guise of organ-growing research. But the ghost of the Sukhumi Nursery still looms. Stalin's project reminds us that the pursuit of a superior being always comes at the cost of the soul. When we strip away the ethics to create a tool, a living war machine, we lose the very humanity we are trying to enhance. Ivanov's experiments were the first step on a path that leads to a world where biology is no longer destiny, but a menu for those with the power to order from it. The super soldier isn't a relic of the past. It is the looming shadow of our own future. The final silence. If you walk the forests of the Caucasus today, you might still find the remnants of the old fences half buried in the mud and the vines. The local elders still warn their children not to wander too close to the places of the beast. They know that some scars on the earth never truly heal. Stalin is gone, Ivanov is a footnote, and the Soviet Union is a memory. But the vibration of the red Frankenstein remains. It is a story of a regime that tried to play architect with the human code and found that nature has a way of striking back. As we look back at the rusted syringes and the empty cages of Sukhumi, we are forced to ask, did they stop because they failed? Or did they stop because they finally realized what they had invited into the world? The cages are empty now. But the silence they left behind is louder than any scream. The experiment is over. Or perhaps it has only just evolved.